Abigail Maren arrived in Salem long after sundown, the cobblestone streets slick from an evening rain that left the town glistening under the lantern-shaped streetlights. She expected the usual. Dusty archives, tourist shops selling plastic broomsticks, and locals eager to retell the same well-polished ghost stories that kept the town's economy afloat. Salem, after all, had been commercialized into a kind of haunted museum, one she thought she could navigate with academic detachment. But the town felt wrong the moment she stepped out of her car. The air was heavy, almost humid despite the cold, as though centuries-old breath still lingered between the buildings. When she passed by shop windows, she caught glimpses of her reflection. But something behind her always seemed to shift a fraction of a second too late, as if struggling to keep up. She dismissed it as travel fatigue. Inside her rented apartment, a creaky second-floor space overlooking an alley that always seemed darker than it should be, Abigail unpacked her equipment with the steady hands of a seasoned historian. She set her voice recorder on the desk, hit record, and began a simple audio log. Arrival in Salem. Research Day 1 begins tomorrow. Her own voice trailed off as the recorder clicked and whirred softly. She turned away for only a moment to hang her coat, and that was when she heard it. A whisper. Soft, breathless, urgent. Abigail. She froze. The voice wasn't her own. And the tone. It carried the cadence of a 17th-century New England accent. Rounded vowels, archaic inflection. Like someone who should have died more than 300 years ago. Her stomach tightened. She replayed the recording. Static crackled. Then the whisper came again. Clearer this time. Abigail Maren, please. The voice sounded terrified. And worse, it sounded like it knew her. Not the historian, not the visitor, but Abigail herself. As though it had been waiting for her specifically. The room, once merely old and drafty, now felt occupied. The shadows seemed to lean in, listening. Abigail stepped back from the recorder, heart pounding, her breath fogging slightly despite the room's warmth. This wasn't a campfire legend. This wasn't a tourist attraction. Something in Salem had recognized her the moment she arrived. And it had called her by name. The night the dead rewound time. Deep, detailed rewrite. The next evening, Salem's fog rolled in early, thick, white, and unnaturally heavy, swallowing the cobblestone paths leading toward the old Gallows hill. Abigail walked slowly, guided only by the dim cone of her flashlight and the brittle autumn wind scraping through the skeletal trees. Each step felt like she was crossing some invisible threshold, leaving the modern world behind in thin, unraveling threads. Gallows Hill looked nothing like the sanitized historical markers she had studied. Up close at night, it felt raw, untouched, almost feral. The wind didn't blow across it the way it should. It circled, spiraled, as if the land itself was exhaling. Abigail set down her recorder again, more hesitant this time. This is just a location survey, she told herself, though her voice trembled. A simple observation. But the hill responded before she even hit record. The air shifted. The world around her dimmed. Then, like a curtain of time peeling back, forms began materializing in the fog. Pale figures, faint at first, flickering like candlelight. Abigail's breath caught as she realized they weren't random shapes or heat mirages. They were people. Men, women, even a few children. Their faces were tight with dread, their wrists bound, their breath visible in the cold night air. Abigail could hear them crying, muttering prayers, begging God, or anyone, for deliverance. Some were so translucent she could see the trees behind them through their bodies. Then came the sound she would never forget, the creak of wooden beams tightening, the snap of rope fibers straining, the collective gasp of a crowd watching the condemned die. The execution. It replayed before her eyes, not once, but over and over, like a grotesque loop trapped between centuries. Each time, the bodies dropped, and then rewound violently back to standing positions as if unseen hands yanked the scene to its beginning. Abigail stumbled backward, horrified, but the spirits didn't acknowledge her. Not yet. Instead, the loop shifted. Subtle at first. One figure turning his head too early, another mouthing words she didn't recall from historical accounts. A woman in the front row stared directly at Abigail, though she wasn't supposed to see her at all. The fog thickened, twisting around Abigail's ankles, pulling her closer to the scene. The past wasn't simply replaying itself. It was noticing her. And worse, the images began bending, cracking like old film. Faces blurred. Ropes hung at impossible angles. The ground rippled beneath the spirit's feet, as though reality itself didn't want to hold this moment together anymore. Abigail's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Something was trying to rewrite the past. And it was using her presence to do it. A figure at the center of the crowd slowly lifted its head and began to raise an arm, deliberately, unnaturally, reaching toward her. "Abigail," it rasped. The same voice from the recorder. Only this time it wasn't frightened. It sounded expectant. Whispers turn into warnings. Deep, detailed rewrite. Abigail barely slept after the nightmare at Gallows Hill. Every time she drifted off, she felt the phantom snap of a rope above her head or heard that same strained voice whispering her name from within her dreams. By dawn, her nerves were raw enough to vibrate. She convinced herself that daylight would make everything rational again. Didn't. When she returned to her apartment, the air felt wrong, thicker, heavier, like humidity rising from a cellar that had been sealed for centuries. The curtains fluttered even though the windows were shut. Her breath fogged lightly in the hallway, despite the thermostat reading a normal temperature. Abigail set her bag down and froze. Her research notes, neatly stacked before she left, were now scattered across the table like someone had rifled through them in a panic. Some pages were crumpled, others folded, and one lay in the center of the mess, perfectly flat as though carefully placed. For words were scratched across it in jagged, uneven lettering. "Run before we do what must be done." Her stomach churned. The handwriting looked frantic, almost violent. The letters pressed so hard they tore through the paper. Abigail reached out and touched the page. It was warm. A faint hiss echoed from the far corner of the room. Then the shadows began moving, not shifting with the light, moving independently, as though they were living things dragging themselves out from the edges of the walls. Tall ones, narrow ones, hunched figures that broke apart and reformed like smoke caught in a wind that she couldn't feel. Abigail backed away, but they followed, gliding across the floor without sound, their shapes warping with every step she took. One came close enough that she felt the temperature drop beside her. Cold swept up her arm. Her breath hitched as she reached out a trembling hand. The figure dissolved beneath her fingers like dust. But it left something behind. A scent. Sharp, bitter, unmistakable. Burning flesh. Abigail staggered toward the window, gasping for air, but the stench only thickened. Panic clawed at her throat. She fumbled for her recorder, her last anchor of logic, and turned it on. Static filled the room, louder, harsher, until it twisted into a hiss of words she couldn't ignore. "Abigail, leave. Leave before we are forced to act." The shadows froze. The temperature plummeted. And for the first time since arriving in Salem, Abigail realized something terrifyingly clear. The ghosts weren't trying to lure her. They were trying to warn her. Warn her about something they feared more than death itself. Something they believed Abigail would not survive. The curse infects the living, deep, detailed rewrite. Salem changed after that night. Quietly at first, like a sickness slipping through the seams of the town. Abigail tried to tell herself she was imagining it, that fear was exaggerating every shadow, every whisper. But the signs were everywhere, subtle and chilling, as if the entire town had developed a fever it didn't yet realize it had. It started with the people closest to her research. The librarian at the historical center, usually bright, chatty, always eager to talk about Salem's past, greeted Abigail with a hollow stare. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her voice reduced to a rasp. When she tried to pull a heavy colonial ledger off a shelf, she erupted into a violent coughing fit. Abigail rushed forward to help, but froze when she saw what the woman had coughed into her hand. Black flakes. Soot. The librarian wiped her mouth, eyes wide with humiliation and fear. I don't know what's happening," she whispered before waving Abigail away, terrified to be touched. The next day it got worse. Abigail had hired a cameraman, Marcus, to document the sites she visited. A skeptic, loud and sarcastic, he made jokes about witches and curses right up until he didn't. He called her at 3 a.m., voice trembling so badly she barely recognized him. "They were in my room," he whispered. "They were hanging from the ceiling, just swinging." Abigail drove to his apartment immediately. She found him curled on the floor, shaking uncontrollably, staring at the empty space above his bed. "There was a noose," he muttered. "It was for me." He refused to continue the project. He left Salem that same morning. Abigail didn't blame him, but the town didn't let him go quietly. As he drove away, every street lamp flickered in sync, like a single, angry heartbeat pulsing through the power grid. And then the neighbors began turning on one another. At first, it was small things, arguments over parking spots, screaming matches over imagined slights. But by day's end, Abigail saw a crowd forming outside a bakery, 2 women shouting accusations of theft, lies, witchcraft. Witchcraft, a word that hadn't been spoken sincerely in centuries. Now it rolled off tongues like venom. Abigail watched with cold dread as the hysteria spread, building in invisible waves she could feel beneath her skin. It wasn't normal conflict. It was something older, deeper. Something that felt as though the town itself was remembering a madness it had once embraced. People slammed shutters, locked doors, whispered about curses under their breath. And when Abigail walked by, conversations stopped instantly. Eyes sharpened, fingers pointed. They didn't know why, but instinctively, viscerally, the town had begun to sense her presence. Or rather, it sensed the curse that had awakened because of her. Everywhere she went, Salem seemed to quiver with tension, like a held breath waiting to collapse into screaming. The ghosts weren't just haunting her anymore. They were reaching into the living, corrupting them, twisting them. And Abigail, for the first time, felt a horrifying truth sinking into her bones. Whatever force bound this town to its history was no longer content to stay in the past. The bloodline revelation, deep, detailed rewrite. The following day, Abigail returned to the historical archives, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. The building smelled of old paper, candle wax, and a faint metallic tang she couldn't place. Dust motes floated in the thin streams of light filtering through the tall, narrow windows. It should have felt familiar, comforting even, like the archives she had worked in all her life. But this room felt different, almost alive, as if it were waiting for her. She sifted through bundles of forgotten manuscripts, brittle ledgers, and letters written in fading ink. Her hands trembled, not from age or exhaustion, but from a gnawing anticipation she couldn't name. Then she stumbled on a folder tucked behind a stack of trial records, as though it had been deliberately hidden. The paper inside was thick, yellowed, and fragile. The seal bore a symbol she had seen before but could not place, the Maren family crest. Abigail's heart thudded violently as she read the first lines. It was a ledger of signatures, judges presiding over Salem's witch trials. Each condemned name listed alongside the judge who had signed their death warrant. And there, unmistakably, was her ancestor, Judge Nathaniel Maren. The ledger continued, noting the exact number of witches condemned under his authority. Dozens. His name appeared repeatedly, ink dark and almost defiant across the centuries. A chill ran down Abigail's spine as a realization sank in. She was the last surviving descendant of the very man responsible for the most executions in Salem's history. The bloodline she had carried unknowingly was tied directly to centuries of terror, accusation, and death. She sank into a wooden chair, the floorboards creaking beneath her, and pressed her palms to her eyes. She had always thought of herself as a detached historian, studying horrors at a safe distance. Now the horrors had found her. The whispers began again, but this time, they weren't coming from the recorder or the shadows in her apartment. They were in her mind, soft but insistent, like someone tapping on a thin membrane between her reality and theirs. Abigail Maren, we have been waiting. The room seemed to darken. The dust motes stilled. Even the air felt thick, expectant. Abigail realized, with a mounting dread, that the ghosts hadn't merely been warning her or pleading. They had been summoning her. Every spectral encounter, every shadow in her apartment, every unnerving message. They were all connected to her bloodline. She wasn't just a historian in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been chosen. And now, the weight of her ancestors' sins pressed down on her, cold and unrelenting, leaving no escape. Salem's past was not a story anymore. It was a reckoning. The town turns against her, deep, detailed rewrite. Word spread faster than Abigail could process. It began with glances, furtive, calculating, followed by whispers that slithered through the streets like smoke. She felt them as soon as she stepped outside. Eyes lingering too long, heads turning sharply when she passed. Even the children, usually oblivious to such matters, fell silent, their tiny mouths pressing into thin, worried lines as they peered around corners. Her hotel, once welcoming, suddenly felt hostile. The clerk refused to hand over her key, muttering something about trouble finding its own kind. The landlord, a stern man who had seemed genial at first, stood on the stoop with folded arms and a glare sharp enough to pierce steel. "You're not welcome here," he said flatly. "Not anymore." Even the local historians she had initially befriended avoided her like she carried a contagious plague. Invitations to speak, access to archives, casual coffee meetups, all vanished overnight. Each rejection carved a deeper hollow into her confidence, and a gnawing suspicion grew that she might be seen not just as an outsider, but as a living symbol of the town's darkest history. Salem itself seemed to recoil. Doors slammed when she walked by. Windows rattled in the cold wind without explanation. Shadows pooled unnaturally at her feet, stretching toward her, then retreating when she tried to focus. Abigail had spent her life studying hysteria and superstition, yet now she understood its raw, corrosive power firsthand. It wasn't just fear. It was recognition and instinctive knowledge of her bloodline. People didn't understand why, and neither did she fully yet, but the weight of centuries pressed down on her. She carried the sins of her ancestor. Even the air seemed to thrum with tension. Conversations hushed when she entered a room. Gossip erupted in her absence, painting her as a reincarnation of the judge whose signature had condemned so many innocent lives. A few bold townsfolk muttered that she brought the curse back with her, though no one dared voice it openly. Alone in the streets at night, Abigail felt the weight of the town's collective gaze as a tangible pressure. Every step echoed against the narrow alleyways, carrying the suspicion, fear, and resentment of hundreds of unspoken judgments. It was as though the town itself had become a living entity, determined to root her out. And in that suffocating, watchful atmosphere, Abigail realized something terrifying. She could not hide, and she could not reason with Salem. Her ancestors' sins had awakened an instinctual memory in the town. And now, every glance, every whisper, every closed door was a reminder that the past was hunting her through the present. The ghosts closed the trap. Deep, detailed rewrite. By the seventh night, Abigail's world had shrunk to a corridor of shadows and whispers. Every evening, as dusk bled into night, the spectral reenactments at Gallows Hill grew more vivid, more insistent. The air felt heavier there, saturated with centuries of fear, anger, and sorrow. Even the soil seemed to pulse beneath her boots, as if the ground itself remembered the countless deaths that had stained it. She approached the hill with a sense of dread she could no longer deny. The fog rolled in thick and sticky, curling around her legs and climbing higher with every step. Shapes began to form in the mist, faint at first, then clearer, until the condemned appeared, standing in rows as they had that night centuries ago. The sound of ropes creaking and the murmurs of the crowd reached her ears, sharp and tangible, like they had been played directly into her brain. Then came the pull. It was subtle at first, her chest tightening, her vision bending at the edges, but quickly it became undeniable. She was no longer merely observing. Each swing of the noose, each shuffling footstep of the crowd, tugged at her, pulling her into their collapsing timeline. Abigail felt it around her neck first, the cold, unyielding pressure of rope. Her fingers clawed at empty air, trying to grasp something solid. The chanting of the crowd rose in a deafening crescendo, echoing in her skull. Her heart pounded, her legs trembled, but she could not escape the force dragging her closer to the center of the spectral tableau. Time warped unnaturally, each swing of the condemned's bodies repeated with subtle variations. Ropes twisting differently, bodies jerking at odd angles, the expressions of agony morphing into terror she had never studied in the records. Abigail realized with mounting horror that the past was bending to her presence, reshaping itself around her, as if the spirits themselves were aware she was there. Every dawn, she returned from the hill with bruises in the exact shape of rope burns etched across her arms, shoulders, and neck. No explanation could account for them, no accident, no reflection of her own movements. They were marks of another time, a warning she could neither ignore nor fully understand. And then, the whisper came again, soft but unmistakable. Abigail, it is not enough to watch. You are part of this. Her reflection in the recorder's lens showed pale skin stretched tight over frightened eyes, a silent scream frozen on her lips. She realized the horrifying truth. The ghosts weren't just performing their own torment. They were pulling her into it, shaping her into a participant, a witness bound to the events of the past in a way that was painfully, undeniably real. The hill, the fog, the shadows, they had become a trap, and Abigail was caught at the center. The ghosts had learned to reach through time itself, and she was their unwilling conduit. A witch who never died. Deep, detailed rewrite. By the 8th night, Abigail's exhaustion ran deeper than her body. It had seeped into her very bones. She was haunted in every corner of Salem, her dreams invaded by rope, fog, and whispering shadows. Desperate for guidance, she sought Eleanor Gray, the sweet, elderly woman who had been her guide and confidant since her arrival. Eleanor had always seemed kind, unassuming, the perfect anchor in a town that had turned against her. They met in Eleanor's modest home, a quaint cottage tucked between ivy-covered walls. Candles flickered in their sconces, casting trembling shadows across the room. Abigail had intended a simple conversation, a check-in, but as soon as Eleanor took her hand, the air shifted, heavy and charged. "I know why you're here," Eleanor whispered, her voice low, almost trembling. "And I know what you've seen." Abigail leaned forward, tense. "You know about the recordings? The shadows? The voices?" Eleanor's gaze flicked to the corner, where the firelight warped into moving shadows, then back at Abigail. "I've seen more than you can imagine. I've walked these nights for centuries, and I've waited for you." Abigail frowned, confusion mixing with dread. "Waited for me? How? Why?" Eleanor's hands tightened around hers. "Because I never died." Abigail froze. I don't understand." Eleanor drew a deep breath. Her frail frame seemed to straighten, strength threading through her voice. "I was one of the witches condemned at Salem. They tried to execute me, but I found a way to bind my soul to this town. I escaped death, though the world believes otherwise. And now, I've been waiting for you to arrive, Abigail Maren." A chill cut through Abigail as Eleanor's words sank in. Every spectral whisper, every shadow, every threat that had stalked her since her arrival now carried a new meaning. Eleanor had been there all along, silently guiding, or perhaps manipulating, the events around her. "You survived," Abigail whispered, her voice trembling. "All this time, hiding here?" Eleanor nodded slowly. "Yes, I am older than you can imagine, and I have lived in the spaces between the past and present. Salem keeps secrets, Abigail, and some secrets choose their heirs. You are one of them." The weight of the revelation pressed down on Abigail. This woman, this kindly mentor, was not merely a survivor. She was an immortal witness, bound to Salem, waiting centuries for the descendant of the judge who had condemned her and countless others. Abigail felt a shiver creep up her spine. The realization came like ice. The town, the shadows, the ghosts, they were not random. They were orchestrated, directed by someone who had played a game over hundreds of years. And now Abigail was in the center of it. Eleanor's eyes softened but glimmered with an unspoken warning. You must understand, Abigail. The past is not done with us. And neither am I. The witch's betrayal, deep, detailed rewrite. Abigail thought she had begun to understand Eleanor Gray. She had seemed like a guide, a kindly mentor offering wisdom and support in a town that had turned its back on her. But that night, in the flickering candlelight of Eleanor's cottage, the truth emerged. Cold, deliberate, and terrifying. Eleanor's expression had shifted. No longer the gentle elder Abigail had known. Her eyes glinted with something older than time, a sharpness honed over centuries. Abigail, she said softly, but the words cut like a blade. You've been listening to ghosts, watching shadows, thinking you are here to help them. Abigail's pulse quickened. I don't understand. Aren't you? Haven't you been guiding me? Eleanor leaned closer, the shadows stretching along her features, making her appear almost predatory. Guiding you? Perhaps. But the truth is far darker than you imagine. She paused, letting Abigail squirm under her gaze. Then, deliberately, she revealed it. The spirits don't want freedom. They want vengeance. All those souls trapped in the cycles of pain, they are waiting for the blood of your ancestor to pay what is owed. And you, Abigail, you are the last living link to him. Abigail's stomach nodded. You're saying they want me? Eleanor's lips curled faintly. Yes, not your help, not salvation. They want you to take your ancestor's place. Abigail staggered back. That's impossible. That can't be. Eleanor's voice cut her off. Impossible? The rope, the gallows, the shadows, they are already shaping you. Each night they pull you closer. Every mark you wake with, every whispered warning. It has been preparing you. Abigail's mind raced, searching for logic, for some way out. But Eleanor's next words froze her completely. I will not be the one dragged into the abyss with them, Eleanor said, her tone calm, almost serene. But I can guide the process. When the hour comes, I will hand you over. I will not fall with them. But you, Abigail, are already theirs by right of bloodline. The cottage seemed to close in on Abigail. Candlelight flickered wildly, casting Eleanor's long shadow across the walls, making it seem as though she were surrounded by a writhing sea of the condemned. The truth hit with a paralyzing force. Eleanor, her mentor, the only person she had trusted, was orchestrating her betrayal, positioning her as the next victim of the ancient curse. Abigail felt panic rise in waves. The room felt alive, like it had been waiting for this moment. Every shadow in the corners seemed to lean forward, attentive, watching the exchange. The whispers from the recorder, the chilling messages, the shadows at her apartment. All of it now made sense. Eleanor had been part of it all. Her blood ran cold. The stakes were no longer academic, historical, or even supernatural in a distant sense. They were personal. And as the final realization settled, Abigail understood the horrifying clarity of her position. The ghost's vengeance was inevitable, and the one she had trusted most was their willing accomplice. The trap was closing, and Eleanor held the key. The final judgment, deep, detailed rewrite. The air on Gallows Hill was heavier than ever that night, thick with the stench of wet earth and centuries-old fear. Fog crawled along the ground like living tendrils, wrapping Abigail's legs in icy coils as she was drawn toward the spectral gallows. The shadows were waiting, a sea of pale, anguished faces pressed together, stretching endlessly across the hill. Their eyes were fixed on her, empty yet accusing, pleading yet unyielding. Every step forward felt like wading through water. The whispers had grown into a cacophony of voices, overlapping, twisting, echoing in her skull. Names she didn't know, cries of terror, the faint clang of chains and the whisper of ropes rubbing against rough-hewn wood. It all collided in a dizzying, nauseating symphony of the condemned. Abigail's throat tightened as the noose lowered before her. She could see the shadows of those who had suffered at her ancestor's hand, their mouths opening in silent screams. Her body trembled, her pulse a deafening drumbeat in her ears. This was no longer an observation, no longer a chance to study the past. She had been drawn into the final act, and she knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that the ghosts expected her to participate. Her gaze flicked to Eleanor Gray, standing just behind the circle of spirits, calm and unwavering. The woman's centuries of cunning and survival shone through her serene expression. She had guided Abigail to this very moment. And now, her true intent was clear. She had positioned Abigail as the final link in the chain, the last payment the curse demanded. But Abigail, though terrified, was not defeated. She saw the faces of the innocent, twisted by centuries of unavenged death. She felt the weight of history pressing on her shoulders, the bloodline's guilt burning into her soul. And then, in that horrifying instant, clarity struck. The spirit's vengeance had a rule, one they had been enforcing across centuries. They sought justice, not indiscriminate destruction. Only the guilty, the ones deserving the curse, could satisfy their need. Abigail realized, with a surge of defiance and dread, that she held the power to break the cycle, not by fleeing, not by screaming, but by choosing who the curse should claim. Her eyes locked on Eleanor, calm, calculating, immortal, and guilty of centuries of manipulation. The truth fell over Abigail like ice. The woman who had appeared to guide her, who had protected herself for hundreds of years, might be the only soul guilty enough to satisfy the spirit's demand. The noose swayed, its shadow stretching over her trembling body. The whispers crescendoed into a roar that threatened to shatter the night. Abigail took a deep, shuddering breath and made her choice. Eleanor's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second, before the shadows surged forward, drawn by the resolve of the one they had been waiting for. The fog twisted violently around Abigail, then coalesced toward Eleanor, pulling her into the collapsing timeline of the gallows, as the spirits exacted the long-delayed justice of centuries. Abigail stumbled back, gasping, her body raw and bruised but alive. Around her, the hill fell eerily silent. The whispers receded, leaving a heavy stillness in their wake. The fog thinned, the shadows retreated, and the night seemed almost calm. For the first time since her arrival, Abigail felt a tenuous sense of release, but it was fragile. Salem had remembered, it had judged, and the past had reached out to claim its final victim. Yet in the silence, she could feel it. An echo of centuries past, a whisper that perhaps, one day, the cycle could awaken again. The hill was quiet, but the memory of the gallows lingered, etched into the fog, into the soil, and into her very soul. Abigail Maren had survived the night, but she had learned something terrifyingly clear.